Welcome, everyone. I am Huri Berberian, Professor of History, Director of the Center for Armenian Studies, and Mehruni Family Presidential Chair in Armenian Studies. On behalf of the Center for Armenian Studies, we welcome you to the last of a three-part series on the Armenian communities in the Middle East. Today, we will focus on Turkey, an apt ending to our series for important reasons, as we shall hear from our presenters and our discussion today. Tomorrow marks the 106th anniversary of the Armenian Genocide, and our webinar today, although not directly related, and although not directly about the genocide, is obviously nevertheless related. The modern Armenian diaspora, after all, including the very communities we have so far dealt with in parts 1 and 2, with the exception of Iran, are the direct consequences of the genocide and barely surviving refugees. Sometimes, although, we forget that Iran's Armenian community too was deeply affected by refugees fleeing the horrors of genocide, although its origins lie in another deportation, one going back to the early 17th century. A few words of thanks before we begin and before I give you a few more details. This webinar is part of the Vahe and Armenian Mehruni lecture series. We would like to thank the Mehrunis, our donors, our supporters, and our co-sponsors, the UCI Department of History and UCI Global Middle East Studies. Speaking of supporters, UCI Giving Day is on April 28th, only 5 days from today. Your support makes a big difference. I hope you will join us on Giving Day to support the UCI Armenian Language Fund and help us make possible the teaching of the very language the genocide almost wiped out. I am grateful for our panelists from across the world, and especially to Tsoli Nalbantian, who helped with the initial thinking and planning of the virtual salon. They have all joined us 3 times for this series, which I think is a great feat and a great commitment, and I'm most grateful to all of them. Thanks also to Dwayne Pack and Saeed Jalalipour for their behind-the-scenes work as always. The webinar will be recorded and uploaded on our YouTube channel within the next week or so. The webinar will proceed in the following way. I will introduce our moderator and facilitator for today, Dr. Tsoli Nalbantian. Dr. Papazian and Dr. Shaklian will make 15-minute presentations, and Dr. Nalbantian will then moderate a discussion among the presenters and all the panelists, after which we'll open up the virtual floor to questions from the audience. Please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to send your questions. Chat is disabled, so you won't be able to use that. You won't be able to raise your raise your hand, and if you are able to do it, we won't be able to call on you that way. So please do use the Q&A function. Please make your questions clear and concise. We will try to get to them, to get to as many as we can, as we see fit. I will briefly now introduce in alphabetical order all our panelists, and in more detail, Dr. Nalbantian will then introduce our presenters. Panelists joining us from Australia, Italy, the US, Armenia, and the Netherlands are James Berry, Research Fellow at the Alfred Deakin Institute, Deakin University. Marisa De La Gata, Adjunct Professor of Political Science at the University of Bari. Harut Ekmanian, International lawyer and attorney in New York. Joanne Randa Nuho, Assistant Professor of Anthropology at Pomona College. Harat Papazian, Lecturer at the American University of Armenia. Christopher Shaklian, Postdoc at the Faculty of Philosophy, Theology, and Religious Studies at Radboud University at Nijmegen. Our moderator is Tsoli Nalbantian, Assistant Professor of Modern Middle East History at Leiden University. She is a historian working on the social and cultural history of the Middle East. Dr. Nalbantian is co-series editor of Critical Connected Histories, Leiden University Press, and has published articles in Mashir and Mahjar, Mesa Review of Middle East Studies, and History Compass. Her book, Armenians Beyond Diaspora, Making Lebanon Their Own, was published in 2019 by Edinburgh University Press. Welcome to you all. Welcome to our attendees. Thank you all for joining us for part 3, which is sadly our last session in this series. Colleen, please take over. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Huri. Thank you so much to our panelists, and thank you also to the audience for joining. So it's a real pleasure for me to moderate our conversation today. And what's really great for me is that we really have the opportunity to reflect in between sessions. So I'm really excited to talk about some of the things we've also talked about in the past today as well. So on to the focus of today's panel. Our first speaker today is Dr. Hrag Papazian. Hrag's research interests include social boundaries and their making, ethnicity and nationalism, religion and race, migration and diasporas, memory, politics and activism. He holds a doctoral degree in social anthropology from the University of Oxford in 2020, where his dissertation about Armenians in contemporary Turkey was recently awarded the David Parkin Prize for, quote, best use of detailed ethnographic material to advance anthropological arguments by the School of Anthropology and the Museum of Ethnography at Oxford. He currently teaches at the American University of Armenia and conducts an EU-funded multi-sited research between Istanbul and Yerevan, examining processes of mobility and issues of dual citizenship and belonging among Armenians of Turkey, looking toward and/or moving to Armenia. Prior to this, he has also researched Armenian political activism in Istanbul and published Between Gezi Park and Camp Armen, the intersectional activism of leftist Armenian youths in Istanbul in the journal Turkish Studies. Hrag will be followed by Dr. Christopher Shaklian. Christopher is a postdoctoral researcher at Radboud University in the Netherlands, part of the Rewriting Global Orthodoxy project in the Faculty of Philosophy, Theology, and Religion. He received his PhD in anthropology from the University of Chicago, with his dissertation, Theology and the Community, the Armenian Minority, Tradition, and Secularism in Turkey. From 2018 to 2020, he served as the director of the Krikor and Clara Zohrab Information Center at the Eastern Diocese of the Armenian Church of America. And before that, he was the Manukyan Postdoctoral Fellow in Armenian Studies at the University of Michigan, an adjunct professor at St. Nerses Armenian Seminary, and a visiting assistant professor at Wesleyan University. He's published work on liturgy and law in the lives of religious minorities, including Promises of Property, Religious Foundations, and the Justice and Development Party's Ambiguous Attitudes Towards Religious Minorities, also in the journal Turkish Studies. Currently, he's working on a monograph entitled Singing the City, the Armenian Liturgical Subject and Minority Belonging in Istanbul. So thank you so much. I'm really excited to hear both of you. So please, Hrag, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Colleen, for introducing me and doing this today. Thank you very much, Huri, for organizing this fascinating series of panels about the Armenian communities in the Middle East. And today's panel is about the Armenians in Turkey, in contemporary Turkey. When we usually speak of or think of Armenians of Turkey, most of us perhaps first and foremost, or even we solely think of the Christian Armenian citizens of Turkey. That is the traditional Armenian community of mostly concentrated in Istanbul, whom we call Bolsahayer, or even when we speak of the Turkahayuchun, these are the people we think of, these are the people we write about. And that's also the case when it comes to Turkish media, and generally that is the general understanding or approach. But the fact is that there are the Armenian population of Turkey is much more heterogeneous and much more complex we can speak of at least 3 factions of Armenians residing in contemporary Turkey, and that's what my thesis looks at. It studies all 3 types or 3 factions of Armenians, and these 3 factions are, first of all, yes, the Christian Armenians who are citizens of Turkey, and second, migrants from the Republic of Armenia, who have started to come since the 1990s, and also a third, Muslim and Alevi Armenians who are citizens of the Republic of Turkey, but who are Muslims officially. Alevis are also officially on their identity cards counted as and categorized as Muslim people, but they identify as Armenians. And these Muslim and Alevi Armenians as well started to publicly emerge since the early 1990s. So we can speak of quite recent diversification of what I call Turkey's landscape of Armenianness. And what I'm going to do today, also knowing that Christopher will mostly present the traditional Christian Armenian community, I will rather discuss briefly the 2 other factions, that is the migrants from Armenia and the Muslim and Alevi Armenians. And mostly I will discuss the contextual and structural developments within Turkey that paved the way for this diversification. So the question I'm addressing here is, why did suddenly this diversification occur? What happened? Why after the 1990s? And let me start with the Muslim and Alevi Armenians. There are 3 main factors that contributed to the emergence of these Muslim and Alevi Armenians. These are internal migration in the country, second, a change in the political climate, and third, the Islamization of society and politics, again, in Turkey. Before I discuss these, let me quickly say whom do I consider when speaking about Muslim and Alevi Armenians. And oftentimes, when I tell people that I research also Muslim and Alevi Armenians, especially when I tell other Armenians about this, the first question that they ask, or the most important question that they ask oftentimes is, how many are they? And my answer to that question is that I cannot tell. Not only I cannot tell, I believe that no one can tell how many Muslim or Alevi Armenians are in contemporary Turkey. The reason for that is that because I am talking and I'm researching, and what I will be presenting now is not the descendants of Islamized Armenians, Islamized during or right after, or even at times decades after or even before the Armenian Genocide. We could theoretically count these people by looking at the state registries, at archives, and by looking at how many Armenians were converted, and then counting their, an estimate of their number of descendants. What I'm looking at here is people who are Muslim or Alevi, but who they themselves identify as Armenians. That is, they are socially Armenians. And that's what, in fact, anthropologists would tell, right? An identity is a social identity, and it really makes sense to count people as Armenians, so socially speaking, in case they identify themselves as such. And so, the first factor is internal migration, as I said, and this started beginning in the 1950s. There was a huge already migration of millions of people, starting peasants, moving from eastern and southeastern regions in Turkey, moving to Turkish urban centers in the west, Ankara, Izmir, but mostly Istanbul. This emigration towards the west even increased further in the 1980s from the mostly Kurdish populated southeast because of 2 reasons. First, neoliberal policies that caused the living standards in the region to further deteriorate, and also, of course, the Kurdish insurgency in the second half of the 80s, which turned into an open armed conflict between the Turkish army and Kurdish guerrillas. Now, many descendants of Islamized Armenians who were still living in those areas naturally participated in this internal migration, and they found themselves in Istanbul. This migration in turn became a factor facilitating, the only facilitating, the revival or establishment of some of these people's links with Armenian identity. Those in Istanbul were now in proximity to the established Christian Armenian community, about which Christopher is going to talk in a few minutes, and its institutions. They had Armenian neighbors, co-workers, and in some cases even relatives who had remained Christian and came to Istanbul much earlier. Second, they soon discovered that being Armenian in cosmopolitan Istanbul was much easier than it was in their villages or small towns in the east. In addition to having moved to a relatively diverse and educated environment, they were now in a large city where their Armenianness, if they so desired, could be expressed situationally and still remain unnoticed, whereas in the village, any such manifestation would jeopardize their relations with the small number of co-villagers. Second factor is changes in the political climate. Now, there were two crucial, interrelated, and mutually supportive processes that evolved in Turkey during the last 3 to 4 decades: a reconfiguration of identity politics and the process of gradual democratization, though the latter was, crumbled starting from the late 2000s. The increasing politicization of Kurdish ethnic identity from the late 70s onwards gradually changed the equations of identity politics in the country. Although met with repression, the Kurdish movement was successful in laying bare the fundamental weakness of the official ideology of ethnic homogeneity. And I quoted Kasaba and Bozdoğan here. And it was instrumental in having ethnicity recognized as a fault line in the country and as a boundary marker between people. In parallel, Turkey was slowly moving towards democratization. The 1980s were characterized by the emergence of new actors, new visions of modernity, and the change in the political mentality. There was a discourse on democratization, civil society, and civil rights. To these internal developments was added the external pressure by the European Union after Turkey was declared an official candidate for full membership. As a result of all of this, ethnic and religious minorities gained unprecedented leverage for articulating and defending their concerns, and the idea of a national Turkish identity based on citizenship rather than ethnocultural Turkishness, as it had always been, started being pushed forward by the state's highest echelons, even by the state's highest echelons. In this context, a post-nationalist critical narrative on the Armenian Genocide, as Fatma Müge Göçek puts it, started to emerge in the country, which was soon followed by unprecedented public discussions about the fate of the Islamized Armenian genocide survivors and their descendants. The emergence of such discussions was soon coupled with, and perhaps even encouraged, actual public claims of Armenian identity by citizens who were officially members of the Muslim majority. Since the 90s, applications by individuals of Armenian descent to Turkish courts asking to change their religion to Christianity and their names to Armenian ones started to gain unprecedented popularity. And this is studied also by Özgül. Other people during the same years started to publicly claim Armenian identity while not becoming Christian, thus coming forth as Muslim Armenians or Alevi Armenians. Third factor was the Islamization of politics and society. For the first 6 decades after the foundation of the Republic, secularism was the Turkish state's preferred self-representation or selected idea about itself, as Navarro Yashin puts it. But things started to change in the 1980s again. In fact, the strongest current to emerge as a result of the general configurations of identity politics in Turkey was Islam or Islamism. Islam gained increasing public visibility and returned to politics. During this period of metamorphosis of traditionally secular Turkey into a Muslim nation, symbolic and political boundaries were at least partly redrawn, especially with the government's policies of the Kurdish opening starting from 2009. The emphasis shifted from Turkishness to Muslim fellowship, somehow bypassing ethnicity again, and remained so at least until the violent redeterioration of Turkish-Kurdish relations in 2016. In this new context, where ethnic differences were downplayed in favor of religious commonality, people, Muslim Armenians, would naturally find it easier to come out as Armenians but Muslims. I quote here one of them, and then I'll move to the migrants from the Republic of Armenia. He says, declaring that one is Armenian but also Muslim has become easier with societies becoming more religious and conservative, because religion has a decisive influence on people's behavior. Once I tell them that I am also a Muslim, they cannot react maliciously toward me. It is religiously forbidden, you know. A Muslim is a Muslim no matter his ethnic or national belonging. Okay, you are Armenians, but you've become Muslim. You are our brothers, they say. They are thus obliged to act respectfully, even if some of them do not really feel comfortable with my being Armenian. So all of these internal factors, in fact, set the context for these Muslim and Alevi Armenians to come out and really reveal their Armenianness or identify as Armenians, even to form some small organizations, start to take or teach courses of the Armenian language, and so on and so on and so on. In parallel, again, from the very beginning of the 1990s, there were Armenians this time coming from Armenia and even further diversifying the Turkish Armenian scene, right? A few details again before I discuss the contextual changes that paved the way for their emergence. In terms of numbers, it is easier in this case. It is estimated their number to be between 12,000 and 30,000. Again, it's not that easy, and that's why we have such a range. And the reason for us not being generally researchers, but also the governments, both governments, not being able to specify the number is that most of them, a vast majority of them, are undocumented migrants who mostly have come to Turkey with touristic visas, but overstayed their visas. A second reason is that some of them have even had children in the Republic of Turkey, in Istanbul, who have neither Turkish nor Armenian passports or citizenship, no papers. They constitute somehow bare lives, as Agamben would have said. And so this makes it difficult to count their number. Also, there are no diplomatic relations between the two countries, which makes matters even worse. One other important detail to mention is that there is a gender imbalance in this community, as most of these migrants are migrant women. Now, what did pave the way, again, for this emergence of this community? Again, there were developments in Turkey that facilitated this, but also let me start by the context in the sending part, that is in Armenia, where there was a crisis in the early 1990s. Migration from Armenia to Turkey, in fact, should be considered in the wider context of a large-scale emigration that hit Armenia since the early 1990s. The devastating earthquake in 1988, political and economic remodeling as a result of post-Soviet independence, and a large-scale war with neighboring Azerbaijan for over years brought forth a period of serious economic, energy, and social crisis in Armenia, thus setting the scene for a significant migration process. But in parallel, again, that would not make Armenians come to Turkey if it were not for the developments in Turkey, this time mostly economic. Surveys suggest that only a small portion, about 1% of general post-Soviet Armenian migration, had Turkey as its destination. But most people coming there were the least privileged among the immigrants, Armenian immigrants. As interlocutors explained, Turkey has usually been the choice of the least privileged, financially speaking, because of several factors: its proximity, its relative cheapness, and the relative abundance of jobs. All of these made it a more affordable option when compared to the main destinations of Armenian migration, such as Russia, other CIS states, USA, and Europe. The relative abundance of job opportunities, perhaps the most crucial factor of all, was the result of changes and developments that occurred again in Turkey during the same period of time. In fact, scholars argue that Turkey had acquired an economic pull factor when political and economic crises were shaking the adjacent post-Soviet region. An increasing demand for low-paid and undocumented labor in the growing sectors of service and informal manufacturing, conditioned by neoliberal economic structural rearrangements of the 1980s, had made irregular labor migration towards Turkey appealing to post-Soviet generally, not only Armenian, but also, and including Armenian, financially vulnerable people. Thus, to conclude, the dire economic situation in the Republic of Armenia, coupled with the development of an economic pull factor in Turkey, the latter's proximity, relative cheapness, and accessibility, generated waves of Armenian labor migration towards Turkey. This migration in turn further diversified the Armenian population of Turkey, adding to the Christian Armenian established community and the Muslim and Alevi Armenians, yet other Armenians with their own interpretation of and expectations from Armenianness, issues that I study in my work, and then I'm happy to discuss further during the Q&A session if questions arise, but I think my time's up.
Thank you so much, Harag. That was actually perfect timing, so thank you. Please, Chris.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Huri. Thank you, Salon, for the organizing and for moderating. My thanks to UC Irvine's Center for Armenian Studies, for the hosts, for my fellow panelists. It's been a really wonderful series of conversations, and I'm thrilled that I get the chance to help bring us home this evening. And of course, as Huri mentioned, it's a particularly appropriate day to turn our attention to the Armenians in Turkey, of course. So I am particularly lucky here because Harag has done a wonderful job, and I love his term here of the landscape of Armenianness in Turkey. And so I appreciate that he's laid this out for me. So I get to jump in with a couple of my themes that I'm going to take up. And as Harag mentioned, I'm going to focus a little bit on this first branch, the traditional Armenian Christian community of Turkey, as Harag put it. And I'm going to do so from a kind of institutional perspective that I think will actually help take a look at why this community continues to be at the sort of center of the imagination. So I'm going to talk briefly under three different headings. The first one is going to be about representing Armenians and taking up this question of who gets to do this. And then I'm going to talk about this important legal category that are called vakifs, often translated as religious foundations. And then I'm going to end with a little bit thinking about some of my work on the practices of the Armenian Apostolic Church under the heading of liturgy and minority rights. So I'll turn first to this question of representation. And if Harag has done this wonderful job showing us sort of the broad who of the Armenian community, who makes up the Armenian community in Turkey with all of these new and expanding branches, another way that we could sort of think about this question of delineation is to ask a related question: who gets to represent the Armenian community? How do we represent the Armenian community, right? And I mean this like who gets to, right? Who has the authority, the ability, the power to do so? And by this, I mean who gets to speak on behalf of the Armenians to the government, to the Turkish government, to the Turkish public, and who gets to sort of have this ability to set what the Turkish Armenian community looks like. Now, I won't go too far into it, but representation is a deeply fraught and important sort of political concept, and it's got a long history in thinking about the Armenians of Turkey, actually. So this is a picture from the collection of the Zorav Information Center of what has been called the Armenian National Constitution, which during the Ottoman period sort of set ideas about how the Armenian community was to function and included questions around who got to do this representation. And there's a lot of really good work on this question within the Ottoman period and on the question of the representation of Armenians in that phase. And historically, the answer to this question of who got to represent the Armenians of Turkey was the Armenian Patriarchate, a very specific institution of the Armenian Apostolic Church. Now, if we want in the Q&A, we can go into a lot of detailed questions around this. For instance, was the Armenian Patriarch a position that was sort of immediate with the Ottoman Empire, or is it something that slowly came into existence? There's a long debate around how the Armenian community was constituted during the Ottoman Empire, and was it part of a so-called millet system with the patriarch sitting at the head of this? These are debates that I think we can take up, and they're ones that have consequences for all of the Middle Eastern Armenian communities that we've talked about so far, actually. But I bring it up here today in part because there is still, even after the cataclysmic, catastrophic genocide and transition to the Republic of Turkey, there's still a sense that the Armenian Patriarchate in some way is the representative of the Armenians of Turkey, despite not only the vast differentiation of the landscape of Armenianness that Harag points us to, but earlier differentiation among the community between, say, Armenian Catholics, Armenian Protestants, other branches of Armenians who are still this sort of traditional Armenian Christian group. Nonetheless, there's a sense in which the patriarch sort of is given the ability to speak for the community. And in fact, often government officials will sort of come to the patriarchate as a sort of, tell us about the Armenians. How are the Armenians doing, right? So this has been the traditional and historical locus of who gets to do this representing. Now, of course, there are contestations over this in the Republic of Turkey, because Turkey's constitution sets out a secular system wherein this is not a formal organization within the Republic of Turkey. This is a kind of inheritance of a modus operandi that has carried on between the gulf between the Ottoman Empire and the Republic of Turkey. So today we could talk about other sort of contending sites from which people make claims to represent this Armenian community. And one of them, of course, is ethnic Armenians in the Turkish parliament, of which today now Garo Paylan is the only one. These are the three members in recent history who were all members, ethnic Armenians who were members of the Turkish parliament. And tellingly, all three of them represented different political parties. So this tells us how complicated this idea of who gets to, say, speak for the Armenians. Because if any of these ethnic Armenians who do not represent the Armenians when they go to parliament, but are members of a party, are representatives of a particular region or city, to the extent that people perceive them as representatives of the Armenians, we can see how complicated this gets, that all three of them are from different political parties with different persuasions and understandings of what that would entail. So this is part of why the traditional sort of authority of the patriarchate to be the representative of the Armenians continues in some way, because these other sites are often very difficult to make a claim on this. Another possible contender for who gets to speak for the Armenians brings me actually to my second topic. It leads me to this question of the Vakifs, because historically, the heads of these foundations, which I will detail momentarily, the heads of these foundations have had incredible sway and have often also spoken for the Armenian community to Turkish sites of governance, or sort of represent out to the broader Turkish public this Armenian community. So let's turn to the Vakifs. A Vakif is often translated as a religious foundation. I also translate it often as a charitable endowment, and it's a legal entity that allows revenue-generating properties to support charitable causes like orphanages, hospitals, mosques, churches. The Vakif bundles together the object of the support, say a church, with a number of revenue-generating properties. So I always like to use the example that, let's say somehow I was wealthy, I wish I was, and I owned a bunch of apartment buildings in Southern California in the middle of Los Angeles that are going to generate a whole bunch of money. And I say, you know what, when I die, I would like all of the money generated by my apartment buildings in the middle of Los Angeles to benefit UC Irvine's Armenian Studies program. And that bundle together would be a Vakif, the bundle of all of the revenue generating properties that support UC Irvine's Armenian Studies program. We would consider the program to be the Vakif, as well as all of those revenue generating properties. So in the Ottoman Empire, non-Muslims as well as Muslims were allowed to create these foundations. So they became the way that churches, Armenian schools, Armenian orphanages, Armenian hospitals, in fact, the largest, this is sort of, we can come back to this. I wanted to put all these details in here if people want to sort of come to them later. The largest Armenian Vakif in Istanbul is in fact a hospital, the Surpurgic Holy Savior's Armenian Hospital. So all of these institutions are under the legal category of Vakif, of charitable property. So in fact, what happened in the transition to the Republic of Turkey is that all of the non-Muslim foundations were grouped together. Not just the Armenian ones, but all non-Muslim foundations were grouped together in what were sort of euphemistically called Jemaat Vakiflara, the community foundations. So all of these non-Muslim groups together found themselves under the same administrative heading. So one of the questions that we posed previously is the question of sort of inter-communal interaction. And one of the concrete ways that this has happened in Turkey is that in 2008, for the first time, a representative from the non-Muslim foundations was chosen to sit on the Ministry of Foundations board. on the General Directorate of Foundations. And this was actually, the first person was a man named Laki Vingus, who came from the Greek community. And he was charged with sort of representing the interests of all of the non-Muslim foundations, not just the Greek ones, and neither just the Armenian ones or any specific group, but all of them together. So this became a concrete way, actually, that we can look at the intercommunal interactions and politics of the different non-Muslim communities in Turkey, grounded in this very important institution. The other thing that happened, in addition to these intercommunal politics, is a kind of intra-Armenian communal politics that play out on the side of the Vakif. Why? Well, think about my example. If I own revenue-generating apartment buildings in the middle of Los Angeles, that's a lot of material wealth and support for whichever foundation I put it to. And some of these foundations, like the sort of Pergich Hospital, have a lot of revenue-generating properties. They're major institutions that command major amounts of wealth and resources. And again, if we note the fact that these support schools, all of the Armenian schools in Istanbul are supported as vakifs. Churches, all of the churches fall under the heading of a vakif. Hospitals, orphanages, all of these sort of social the social help that is directed to the Armenian community is funneled through this institution of the vakif. So the question of the control over the vakifs and who runs these vakifs becomes a site for intra-communal Armenian political action. And in fact, one of the things that happened is that there was a question of the representative status of the leadership of these vakifs. So in 2012, what was called the Düşünce platform, we could call it the opinion platform, put together a sort of working group to see what was going on with the administration of these vakifs. And they found, for instance, that of over 50 or so vakifs within the Armenian community, about 3 of them were run by women. So the question of the representative ability of these major institutions that do so much work for the community, how representative of the community are they? So these vakifs became an important site of both inter-community kind of political action and an internal Armenian debates over who gets to represent the community, who gets control over these material resources from which to do communal, collective Armenian projects. So these foundations, what I often call the material basis of collective communal endeavors, support all of these different projects, but perhaps most visibly, they support the churches. These churches are also part of all the churches in Istanbul are vakifs. Legally speaking, they're vakifs. So here's a nice map from a book published by the Hrant Dink Foundation that shows the distribution of the churches around Istanbul. And if thus far I've focused on the representation of Armenians in Turkey to the government and the larger Turkish public sphere, as well as the material basis for communal life and the debates over them, and I think both of these things could be seen as a form of political activity playing out in what Lerna Ekmekcioglu has called the sort of the Armenian public sphere, distinct from a Turkish public sphere and distinct from a sort of private space. We can see these as sort of, all of these are political activities directed at that Armenian public sphere. I want to end with a slightly different note, looking at these churches that are one of the major parts of the vakif, and looking specifically at how the liturgical life of the Armenian Apostolic Church can be seen as a mode of placing Armenians in Turkey and specifically asserting a kind of presence in the city of Istanbul specifically. So Armenian churches within the city of Istanbul, but also, and here's just some around the city, but also, it's going to play and I don't want it to yet. Oh, I thought I have an Armenian church outside of Istanbul to show you as well. But these movements around the city, 2 different churches trace out what I call a minority geography of the city. By using the liturgical life of the church, there's a movement around Istanbul. So when I was doing my field work, this would happen multiple days a week, that different deacons and cantors and parishioners and faithful would move around the city from church to church on different days of the week in order to conduct liturgy, to go to the Armenian Barak of the Armenian church. And by doing so, one of the things that I've been thinking about in my research, and I'll end with this idea, is that they place themselves through liturgical practices into the urban fabric of Istanbul. And what I'm currently doing some of my research on is thinking, to what extent can we think of this as a different mode of asserting a right to the city, a different mode of presence making in the city of Istanbul, right? If I've talked about these representational possibilities of the communal political work done on the sites over material arguments, I want to suggest also that the liturgical life of the church might be one way of placing Armenians within the city of Istanbul and within Turkey as a kind of assertion of minority presence, and possibly even a way of claiming a kind of what I'm calling a minority right to the city. And so, oh, that's me telling myself to stop. And I want to end by seeing this, you know, and I'd love to talk more about this, but by thinking of this as a way of making that claim on presence, a way we can maybe say of saying Menkosenk, Burada is, we're here. Thank you. I get to stop my share.
Thank you. Thank you so much, both to Hrag and Christopher. That was a lot to take in. So I'm a little sorry I'm a moderator, because I'd like the time to actually really think about and really digest what you brought up. But I think we can in this conversation that I'm hoping that we can expand upon between you two, and then as we open it up to us all, and then also to incorporate some of the audience. And so I just encourage the audience to go ahead and write in the Q&A your questions as they come to you. So, you know, both of you, maybe a little bit more, to be honest, Christopher, but both of you talk about belonging. And both of you, and Christopher maybe a little bit more so, talks about the concept of a minority. And I wanted to, and placing Armenians, you sort of ended that, like, with hopefully, actually, frankly, an optimistic sense. Maybe I can get to that later about why there's a need for this optimism, or why I read that there's some type of optimism in what you're saying. But with regards to minority and belonging, what you both didn't mention is actually the concept of diaspora. And I wanted to hear a little bit about your feelings about this. You know, I think that the rest of the panelists, I'm going to speak a little bit for them just for a minute, wouldn't necessarily have a problem talking about what the, you know, Armenian communities in Lebanon being a diaspora and also being a local community. I don't think that that's contentious. But somehow it seems to be contentious with regards to Turkish Armenians. And I wanted to know a little bit about your feelings about that, given what you work on, and also what you have seen. And why is it that there seems to be this contention? Is it just simplistically because of the Armenian Genocide? That seems a little too simplistic to me. And I can expand upon that if you want to know more. But I think we can maybe stop there. But what do you both feel about that? And I don't know who would like to go first. That I won't call upon, but I'm going to mute myself and you both decide.
Should we do rock, paper, scissors on that, Hrag? Or I can say a couple things. Thank you, Salon. I think it's a really important question, and it's, you know, one of the sort of thoughts that I opened my dissertation with. It was actually that, you know, when I said, oh, I'm going to Turkey to do research, a lot of questions from the Armenian diaspora, folks that I knew within the Armenian diaspora, would be, why, what are you doing there? You know, why go there? You know, shouldn't all the Armenians in Turkey just, you know, move to the Republic of Armenia or something like that? And I think that actually, you know, one of the things that Hrag, you know, neither of us talked about, but that we could place, I think, within Hrag's sort of opening up of these new possibilities, and some of the transformations that happened, I think also happened within the broader Armenian diaspora, of a kind of recognition of the Armenians that remained in Turkey and a willingness to engage with them. And I put this way because that already says that the Armenians in Turkey are somehow not of the rest of the diaspora, right? The way that the other diasporan Armenians spoke to me when I first went, the feeling of going there somehow suggests that something is a little bit different there. And you know, I think one of the things has to do with that, actually, has to do with sort of the perception of the Armenian diaspora broadly, and the sort of the landscape of the diaspora, that perhaps there was a sort of exclusion, not by, say, Armenians in Turkey, but by other diasporans of what constitutes the diaspora. You know, within the discourse in Turkey, you know, I think there's argument about whether or not you want to use the term diaspora. And part of that has to do with the place of the city of Istanbul, right? Which, of course, is not, you know, there's nobody who's going to draw a map of historic Armenia that puts Istanbul in historic Armenia. But because of its central place in, you know, the life of Armenians in the Ottoman Empire, it became a sort of extension of, you know, if not, you know, the capital of Western Armenian life for so long. And I think because of that legacy, there's also a sense that it's not quite, you know, the diaspora in the sense that other places are the diaspora. Those are just two thoughts. This is, I think, is a great question that's super generative, but those are a couple initial thoughts on that.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Tolin, for the question. Thanks, Chris, for the comments. I'll say some more. I totally agree with what Chris said, and I'll try to add a bit. It's a very complicated issue, in fact. So I'll try to have to answer it from, you know, from an emic perspective. Why do they themselves do not? So I don't call them a diasporic community, because most of them do not call themselves. Here I'm speaking about the traditional Christian Armenian community, right? Citizens of Turkey. Most of them do not call themselves as diasporic. And trying to understand this stance, I spent a lot of time thinking, and here's what I can tell, a few stuff. So first of all, there are some people, I would divide them into, I would put them into two categories. One of, you know, the first category is, for me, not unambiguous, completely understandable. These people are the ones who say that we truly feel belonging to Istanbul and nowhere else. We have no feeling, or we might have some cultural interest in Armenia, but we don't consider Armenia a homeland. We don't see any other homeland. The sole place, the sole location to which we consider a homeland, or to which we belong, is Istanbul, because of, as Chris said, its old history, its institutions, the important place it had, and the important role it has played in Western Armenian culture, Western Armenian language, literature, and so on and so on and so on. And so these people do not have diasporic stances. And I follow Roger Brubaker's approach, who asks, or who invites academics to treat people as diasporic in case they have diasporic stances, rather than by looking at them and looking at maps of nation states and then deciding whether, if they're outside, then they are diasporic. He says that diasporic are the ones who have diasporic stances, just like, in fact, Armenians, Muslim Armenians are those who have Armenian stances. And so these people do not have diasporic stances because they do not look at any other place, any other location, any other nation state, and consider it to be their homeland versus where they are. But the second part, which is more ambiguous and more difficult, was more difficult for me to understand, are those people who say, no, we realize Istanbul is not our homeland. Our homeland is Mush, Sasun, Van, Sebastia, Sivas, Malatya, where we come from. And this is the reason behind this is that a vast majority of current day Istanbul Armenian community representatives are children of people who were born not in Istanbul. It's not the old Istanbulite Armenian community, which has mostly immigrated towards the West. These are people who have been coming to Istanbul, who have been refreshing the Istanbulite Armenian community in all decades, even until the 1980s. There were people, villages from Sasun, who left Sasun and came to Istanbul. And they would say, no, my homeland is definitely not Istanbul. My homeland is Sasun. But they would deny them to, they would reject to be called diasporic. And how to explain this? I think there are at least three explanations. One is, I would call it cognitive geographic, and also being tied to the very methodological nationalism, in this case of not of academics, but of people, normal people, right? Of them saying that, yes, we're in Istanbul and our homeland is Sasun or Mush, but it's still within the same nation state, right? We left our hometowns, we left our Hayrenik, our homeland or whatever, Sasun, but we didn't really leave our country. And so there's somehow, things get, very blurry. Boundaries get very blurry. On the one hand, you have Sasun versus Istanbul, but then you have Turkey, right? And you would not feel yourself having left that land. We never went anyway, they would say. It's not like the Lebanese Armenians, we went to another country. This is on the first hand. And then two other issues, and I'll stop there because I can go on and on about this topic. It fascinates me. It has to do with their own politics and with their own politics of survival in Istanbul as Armenians living in Turkey. One thing is that they have been and they still are very cautious not to trigger any anti-Armenian activity or anything, discrimination against them. And the thing is that Ermeni diasporası, that is Armenian diaspora in Turkey, is perhaps the worst category you want to belong to. It's the worst type of being an Armenian, because it's the most vilified, it's the most, on the part of the media and on the part of the government, because these are the Armenians who make the fake propaganda of the fabricated Armenian genocide, right? These are the terrorist Armenians who have been killing our diplomats, Asala, and so on and so on. And so you really do not want to call yourself diasporic Armenian. Unless you get associated with those. And the last thing is, again, having to do with their politics, but this time they always struggle with the fact of trying to prove to the Turkish government, to the Turkish people, their neighbors, their classmates, that we didn't come from elsewhere. We didn't come from Armenia. We belong to these lands. You keep, excluding us, but we belong to these lands. Now, if you tell them we are diasporic, because, they're not going to understand that you're the diaspora of Sasun, which is part of the historical Armenia, but you're the diasporic in Istanbul. You won't tell them you're diasporic again, because you would jeopardize your own struggle of trying to tell them that, no, you belong, you are here. They would tell them, right, you came here, we were here earlier than you were here. And these are my explanations, my thoughts about this.
So it's interesting, right? Because the concept of diaspora is incredibly loaded, and you're sort of increasing the way it can actually be loaded. But it's interesting because you mentioned, Harag, that using this nation state to using the nation state as a way to demonstrate localness. I mean, in this way, the Turkish nation state is actually a claim of Armenianness and of locality in that way, right? I mean, so using the nation state of Turkey is actually beneficial in this case for Armenians from Turkey to claim their indigeneity in a way. So it makes me think a little bit more about the not only the nation state, but of course, not the capital of the nation state itself, Ankara, but more of Istanbul, and what the meaning of Istanbul actually seems to be here. And maybe we can talk a little bit about class, both of you, because it seems that there is this desire to be of Istanbul. Has something to do with also how Istanbul was imagined even prior to the genocide, of it being, a more cosmopolitan place, right? and what that meant. And maybe if you can also open up even the three, you opened up the three communities of Armenians, Hrag and Chris also, but to what extent does class intersect here?
Would you like to go first, Chris?
Why don't you start?
All right. Yeah, thank you, Tsolim, again. A very relevant question. Yes, class does definitely traditionally has historically, been an important category, but also tool of exclusion in relation to also Istanbul and who belongs or who can make claim to being an Istanbulite, right? To being a Bolsahai. As I said, currently, there are some Bolsahais who would say about other Bolsahais that they are not real Bolsahais. We are Bolsahais, because these are the ones who really are a minority, a tiny minority within the minority, who have been there, who are the descendants of the old Bolsahais. Who are therefore, they said my grandfather's grandfather was here. So these Amiras and so on and so on. And the other ones, of course, have been coming from the eastern regions as part of that migration process that I spoke about when speaking about the Muslim Armenians. But the fact is that with that migration process, there were also these Christian Armenians coming, and of course, Istanbul has always been, Turkey's most, or the Ottoman Empire's most, the richest city, the center of all activities. And every time people would come from the Kavars, as they would call, so the Kavartis would come to Istanbul, and the Bolsahais. And there was this class difference. There had always been, because these people would come from the villages or the small towns, and they used to be, and they still are relatively poorer than the old Bolsahais are or could be. So in that sense, that had played a role of creating yet other layers in addition to the layers that Chris mentioned, the denominational layers of Catholics, Protestants, and then Orthodox or Apostolics. But there was also this class issue, which was also very much regional, as you say, between the Bolsahais, the rich, the Amiras, and so on, but also the Kavartsis, who were not only poor, but were also treated as poor or uncivilized or undercivilized, and so on and so on. The thing is that in current day Istanbul and the Armenians there, somehow the migrants from the Republic of Armenia have come to replace the traditional Kavartsis when we look at it in this through this prism of class relations, and from the prism of newcomers or fresh off the boats, so-called, versus old Bolsahais. And they are, and there's a huge class issue there, because most of the migrant Armenian women who come, they come to work as domestic servants in the apartments of local Istanbulite Armenians, or old Kavartsi, now Istanbulite Armenians, who look down this time themselves down on the migrants coming from the Republic of Armenia. So that class issue is always there.
The only thing I would add is that one of the things that I alluded to at the end of my talk that I'm really interested in is sort of thinking of the geography of Istanbul, right? And thinking about Armenians emplaced within Istanbul. And one of the things that I found really fascinating about this is the way that these things get mapped onto Istanbul as well. So there are, a handful of neighborhoods that are sort of known to be Armenian neighborhoods, because over time, from that map I showed with churches dotted everywhere, a few neighborhoods have sort of become concentrated and known as Armenian neighborhoods, but they're not created equal. And often, one of those three is often the places where the folks from the provinces land first, and then you sort of move up into one of the other neighborhoods where many Armenians are. So the sort of this minority geography of the city actually also layers on these things like class, how soon you came from the provinces, as well as language. So one of the things that I always found is that the neighborhood where that is known for being sort of a little poorer and is also known for being more recent arrivals from the provinces is also much more Turkish speaking. And so you'll hear, for instance, sermons given, like at a church in America, you'll have the sermon in English. In that neighborhood, you'll hear the sermon in Turkish. But in the sort of the high class, Armenian Istanbul neighborhood, it's an Armenian sermon. And so there's just layers of these sort of markers of belonging that have to do with class, with language, that layer onto each other, that also layer onto the geography of the city, such that these different Armenian neighborhoods of the city are not created equal. And the final thing I would say to that is that one of the things that I always found so fascinating is that the Armenian Patriarchate, located in the neighborhood of Kumkapı, Armenians used to live there, like in the 19th century. And for a while now, it has not been an Armenian neighborhood. And in fact, is now known as a pretty poor neighborhood with migrants from all over the world. Actually, you'll see a lot of the most diverse of the city in the neighborhood of Kumkapı. And guess what? This is where a lot of the Armenians from the Republic of Armenia end up living. So there's this sort of layering of this movement onto already decided sort of class distinctions within the geography of the city. So that's the only thing I would add, is that sort of layering with the geography of the city.
So maybe I'll ask one more question, and this is to everyone. I think maybe it's nice to start getting everyone involved. It's the theme about movement, right? So we're talking now about Armenians coming from Armenia into Turkey. I thought maybe it might be apt to talk a little bit about how that reflects upon the other co-panelists about pressure of those Armenians leaving to Armenia. And how does this intersect sort of with your work, to all of you, as we're hearing about Armenians actually, I'll be like crude, floating in ways the community of Istanbul, right? Armenians from Armenia floating the Armenians in Istanbul and serving them, but in essence, maintaining that community, right? In the service industry, you're maintaining. So how does that like intersect with, with James, with Joanne, with Marisa, with Harut, and also to myself, like with that pressure, if at all, to move to Armenia. And maybe even we can talk, throw in sort of what I think is the existential crisis that seems to be inflicting Armenia now, or what actually we seem to hear about an existential crisis in Armenia. I don't know how it is. Hrag, you would be the person I would ask for that. How does that work with what's going on in Armenia? So, in light of the recent war, et cetera. So, I don't want to call in anyone. I'm hoping that someone wants to jump in. So I'm
happy to say a few words just to kick it off. Actually, to answer the question is also to bring it back to the other themes that you were talking about earlier, because one of the areas which has been alluded to, but I don't think it's been said specifically, is within the Western Armenian diaspora, as in like in Australia, United States and other places, the Turkish Armenian community is quite different from the rest of the community. They often they have their own, in Australia they have their own institutions. They don't send their kids to Dashnak schools, and they often, the church that they go to is also influenced by that. And part of that is Turkish language, the use of Turkish language. A lot of the Turkish Armenians I know here in Turkey, they speak Armenian, and when they come here, they speak Turkish because it's a symbol of their community. In a great way, but also because I've done a number of interviews with Turkish Armenians, particularly in Melbourne, how they describe themselves. So the rest of the community calls them Bolsahayev, but most of them just call themselves Armenian. And the idea of being Armenian and Turkish is not a mutually exclusive thing. You can be both. Whereas for the rest of the community, it's almost like, no, you're either one or the other. Like you're. It's almost like there's enmity between the two. And that also reflects on how they look at homeland from an Australian perspective. So many of them invest in apartments in Yerevan, for example, but they also maintain properties, family properties in Turkey. So the two of them are also, it's almost like there's a dual homeland. It's the dual diaspora that it's been written about with Sephardic Jews and other communities. But that's just a comment that I'm adding on that, just from observation from looking at the Turkish community in Australia, Turkish Armenian.
May I jump in, say something about it? So regarding movement, what I find so interesting about this topic is that, for example, when we talk about a repatriation, also the so-called repatriation of Armenians to Armenia, the so-called ancestral land. And so this is also very, let's say, morally loaded concept. And because there is this sort of moral imperative of Armenians and Armenian diasporas to eventually go back to the ancestral homeland. But what I'm finding also, continuing on researching, is that there is a discrepancy of approaches towards so many issues. So this could be applied to repatriation, could be applied to genocide recognition, could be applied to war with Azerbaijan on Nagorno-Karabakh. And this is a discrepancy between the approaches of the leaders that usually adopt a pragmatic approach, and so pragmatism, and the approach of diaspora and a part of Armenian civil society in diaspora, which has a more idealist stance. Yeah, if I may, I would like to ask a question to Christopher. So when you talk about representation of Turkish Armenians and who gets to represent them, did you look at the narratives that were actually generated? And also, shall we question ourselves? Because I found really interesting what Harag said about the very existence of the Armenian Turkish community. And also, I'm thinking of the genocide as a weapon of political pressure, also in diplomatic and foreign policies, but we tend to ignore also the importance of recognized genocide recognition for the Turkish Armenian communities. So questions to both of you, both the panelists.
So maybe Harag or Christopher, you can take that up, and then I can continue to ask the others to chime in about the immigration of Armenians from your specific communities.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, the thinking about representation, I didn't do like a survey or even really sort of address it directly head on all the time. I didn't ask the question like who do you think represents the Armenian community? But you can see in a lot of the different debates that these things do play out. So for instance, when talking about the Vakifs, one of my favorites is that there's some of the heads of these Vakifs who do actually sit down with Erdogan on occasion and speak for the Armenian community, you get comments afterwards, and one of my main ethnographic techniques was to buy the Armenian, one of the newspapers every day, and to sort of, show up wherever, whichever church, wherever it was I was going, or, someone else would have one, and you sort of, you pick it up and you begin from there, because the Armenian, there's 2 daily papers in the city, and one of the first references is the papers reporting on the Armenian community of Turkey first, and then on the global Armenian community, and then on issues they'll translate on political issues in Turkey, and so it's a sort of open generator. And actually, I think I quickly passed through a picture where like I made a cameo in the Armenian newspapers, right? I mean, it's very referential to the community, so it's a good generator to start these things. And whenever one of these heads of these big vakifs would show up in a picture in the Armenian papers, talking to Erdogan, you would inevitably get these sort of comments like, who he doesn't speak for us. Who does he think he is, right? And likewise, you would get these things from other kinds of people in response to questions about the patriarchate, right? That like, why are they going there? Why are they going to him, right? He doesn't speak for us. So I think more than anything, that phrase sort of like, who speak, like who he doesn't speak for us, or that a variation of that kind of language I did encounter quite a bit. I in my interviews, I didn't sort of bring in my loaded question of representation directly, but that's sort of, when thinking of, who speaks for, then that's a conversation that people have actually. And you see it also, I like to distinguish between, what people have called sort of political and semiotic representation at times, right? So largely I've been talking about sort of the political representation, right? Who gets to speak on behalf of somebody. But the other one, the sort of the semiotic one, is who gets to draw the picture of what Armenians look like in Turkey, right? Who gets the ability to sort of say who's in, who's out, right? The questions that Hrag is asking. And you would find these, one of my most interesting moments was when actually, I think you were probably a presenter at this, the Hrant Dink Foundation organized a conference on Islamized Armenians. And again, I came with my newspaper and I said, oh, this event is advertised, I'm going to go to this. And folks at church were sort of like, we don't know about it. And I'm like, well, that's nonsense. Of course you know about it, because it's been in every Armenian newspaper for the last 2 weeks. But what you're telling me is that you think that this topic is kind of dangerous, and that, admitting Muslim Armenians to the, grand consort of Armenians of Turkey is going to be a problem for that picture representation of who Armenians in Turkey are. So those are the ways that I sort of got at it, right? Both in these kinds of, you see people saying, not sure if that's Armenian of Turkey. And then you also get the sort of, he doesn't speak for us.
Yeah, definitely. I'll just say I'll just develop a bit the last part. That's where exactly Muslim Armenians and Alevi Armenians come in relation to and with the leadership of the Christian Armenian community, and particularly the church and the patriarchate, the patriarch, or the tenant. It's not only the fact that who can speak for or who can represent Armenians, but also the church oftentimes takes the position of having the monopoly to decide who is Armenian, who is not, as Chris said, but also to grant Armenianness to those Muslim Armenians and Alevi Armenians who are willing to, in the church's opinion, willing to become Armenian. And that means to get baptized in the Armenian church. And so from their perspective, they would oftentimes, for instance, Ateshian would quite openly and rudely even would exclude the Muslim, non-Christian Armenians, Muslim Armenians, and Alevi Armenians from Armenianness altogether, saying that no one considers them as an Armenian. I don't, and the state doesn't, because and there is some reality in what he says in terms of legal understandings of minorities in Turkey, and to understand this we have to go back to the Treaty of Lausanne, which divides Turkish society between Muslims and then there are no ethnic minorities. There are only the non-Muslim minorities, which include Armenians, Greeks, and Jews, and Assyrians, though less mentioned. And accordingly, if you're a Muslim, then you're part of the Muslim majority. So you're a Turkish, you're not an Armenian. And so the church has this approach that if they're Armenian, then let them come and become Armenian. So that is, let them come to me, and I will make them Armenian. That there is that approach, and that is also, that's both a means perhaps of trying to maintain that political monopoly of being the last room from where anything having to do with Armenians or Armenianness should pass through, for instance. But also there are also, again, other strategic calculations about having to do with relations with the state. Would the state want the state be how would the state look at this fact of Muslim Armenians, especially the Alevi Armenians? Some of them are close to the Kurdish political movement, right? And they come up, they speak of the genocide, they say we've been massacred, they say we've been converted, forcefully during the genocide, and we don't want to do anything with these people. So there is that as well. Just like the Armenian diaspora is something to avoid. Also, to some extent, the Muslim and Alevi Armenians are also something to avoid because of that as well, because of their political motivations as well. Because in fact, and I'll end it here, as I said, the fact that many Muslim Armenians started to come out and emerge publicly in media was also something very political. It's also their coming out, their becoming Armenian is also a political act of resistance against their lineages, assimilation, and constant discrimination. And thus, oftentimes their discourse is quite politicized, which makes the representatives of Armenianness a bit, uncomfortable.
I don't want to monopolize, but I just want to add a very quick thing, because I think one of the things that is really important to me and in understanding this is the sort of the institutional part there too. So Hrag sort of mentioned the legal, but the legal butts up against the institutional. So let's say you want to send your child, you're a Muslim Armenian, and you want to send your child to an Armenian school in Istanbul. Because of the way that those are structured, you have to be an Armenian. How do you prove that you're an Armenian in order to attend an Armenian school? Well, the easiest and the number one way is to have a certificate of baptism. So we see the sort of the institutional friction that continues to bolster the authority of these traditional representatives of the Armenian community, these gatekeepers, in institutional ways as well.
Yeah, definitely. That would hold true to Lebanon too. But Harut, you wanted to come in, please.
Yes, thanks, Tolin. So with regards to your question about the phenomenon of Armenians moving into the Republic of Armenia and migration movements in relation to Istanbul Armenians, as Chris also said, I also didn't do any survey or any sort of that kind of work, but I can testify to many of the Istanbul Armenians who, after 2016, 2017 political crackdowns in the country and the movement towards more authoritarianism, there was a run on passports and real estate by Istanbul Armenians in the Republic of Armenia. I mean, I can remember passing by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs where they do the paperwork for passports and hearing every time Bolsahais speaking to each other in lines, in very long lines in the summer of 2017. And that continued afterwards too. Probably most of them didn't move immediately, but they were keen on taking the passports as a guarantee because they don't know what may happen in the coming period. That there was a run on passports, there was a run on real estate in Armenia, just to be secured and to be on the safe side. There was also a question in the audience asking about if somebody can elaborate on why the Armenian community in Turkey was silent in the war in Karabakh and in the face of human rights violations, which might have deteriorated diaspora's perception of Turkey's Armenian community. I think there is a misconception in this question because as far as I know, and as far as I'm aware of many Armenians and activists and academics I interact with during the war, there was a common understanding that Armenians of Turkey are hostages in an authoritarian country where they cannot really freely express their views. They've been already suppressed, and we've been listening for an hour now with our panelists how they've been so creative in finding ways to navigate in the difficult environments in Turkey. Adding to that conditions of war and increased levels of racial hatred with cars marching in Armenian streets in Istanbul, threatening with Azerbaijani flags and slurs. I don't think we can really speak about demanding Armenians of Istanbul expressing any political opinion in regards to the war in Karabakh, and that understanding was, I think, very common and very well known among Armenians abroad, especially in the United States and other places, and also in Armenia. So that's in relation to the question coming from one of the audiences.
Thanks, Harut. Joanne, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I'll just add something maybe briefly about how the not just immigration, but really the focus within the diaspora on supporting the Republic of Armenia after the independence really shifted things in the field site or my area of focus, which was Armenians in Lebanon. So a lot of the organizations which just, did really more than just basic relief. And especially now with all the crises happening in Lebanon, we're talking about clinics, support for schools, even food aid. These are some of the resources that were really sort of channeled through Armenian American organizations and other Armenian diasporic organizations, and had been really since the 1920s and 30s. And what I kept hearing, both when I spoke to the boards of these kind of various organizations, as well as people on the ground in Lebanon, was that there was a kind of shifting of priority to the Republic of Armenia and away from these communities that were, the members of which were largely descendants of people displaced after the Armenian Genocide. So basically, the concern was sort of twofold. One, what will happen if the only spaces of Armenianness are in the Republic? And although people didn't always feel comfortable saying this out loud or being quoted on it even, there was a kind of distinction, right? Like I had many of my interlocutors tell me, well, we're from Giligia, actually, and Hayastan is important. But for some of my interlocutors, Armenia is just one, it's another space. It's not really where they understand their origin or their sense of belonging. And they actually looked with concern at the erosion or deterioration of their communities in Lebanon and in Syria as well. And that these were important spaces for Western Armenian, for just their identity, and for now 100 years, really their home. So I think there is a kind of quiet trepidation about not being collapsed into one sort of category or community, and a kind of fear that there will be a sort of abandonment of the forms of support and just connection and priority that they had sort of prior to independence. And especially, I have not done any current research on this, but I can imagine with everything that happened in the past year, both in Lebanon and in Armenia, that those multiple areas of crisis are also depleting and stretching thin, whatever resources there were before. But there was this kind of overwhelming feeling that they didn't want to be forgotten. They wanted the sort of diasporan community around the world and the organizations to really think about how important it was that Armenians are in Lebanon and had been, that there are publishing presses, that there's cultural production, that it's a space where Western Armenian is spoken and written. And there was a feeling that that was somehow going to be diminished. So, but often people would not feel comfortable kind of being really vocal about this and would sort of back away from it, because they also had this competing understanding themselves that Armenia's independence was really important for them, and they feel very tied to the issues that are happening there, even from a remove like that. So it's, I guess in short, it's complicated, but certainly there's a lot of issues happening around that.
And I wonder if that has changed since the war in Karabakh and Artsakh last fall, because I think that sometimes like this, and this is for all of us as a sort of a question or something to think about, the desire to demonstrate that you are there wherever there is, and you know, this is like what Christopher and Hrag were talking about, this we are here, but then opening up the here and the we, and maybe even the are for that matter, is you know, is something in a particular situation when Armenia is seen as in some form as not necessarily fixed, but safe, for lack of a better term. But that's not necessarily the case now. Like, I know of families who wanted to move permanently to Armenia from Lebanon after, you know, just with the ensuing economic crisis, and of course after the explosion, that now actually put their plans on hold. I think maybe long-term they may end up there, who knows, but that was only, you know, the desire to remain sometimes is only because somewhere else actually isn't critical. You know, so this desire to want to show publishing houses and presence in Istanbul, Beirut, Syria for that matter, you know, Iran, maybe less so, but still I think you could certainly make the connection. How does that change for all of us? Given what has been happening in Armenia and in Karabakh and, you know, and Artsakh. I don't know who would love to pick that up. I can call on you, my class, but I'd rather not. Yeah.
Yeah, now just saying something on Syrian Armenians on this matter. I think it's a bit too early to tell, but actually, especially, let's say, conflict, I define this as a conflict-generated diaspora of diaspora, because most of Syrian Armenians were forced to leave Syria and find a shelter in Armenia. And most of them had already plans to go back to Syria, and this is why I call them a diaspora of diaspora, because there is this idea of dispersal from a center, which was Aleppo, the community of Armenian community of Aleppo. And so, so we had these two elements already even before the last tensions. And so we had these two elements of dispersal from the Armenian community of Aleppo and the desire to go back there to where they belong.
Anyone else?
Yeah, in the case of Turkey, I'll be very quick. In the case of Turkey, I think it's a bit early to say. As Harut said, after the recent, the further deterioration of the political climate in Turkey and the economic conditions also in parallel, there was a definitely, I agree with Harut, and in fact, that's what I'm working on now. There was a rise of interest towards Armenia amongst Istanbul Armenians. Most of them thinking of applying for the Armenian passport or citizenship. Some of them, a small number of them, moving to Armenia, like university students at the American University of Armenia, for instance, but mostly applying to the, for citizenship. And that was a really a trend. And the trend in the real sense of the word, like people hearing from each other, oh, I got the passport, why not? Oh, how is it? It's easy, then let me apply as well. You never know what's going to happen here. And also, as Harut said, buying apartments in Armenia. There was even this talk when I was still during fieldwork in Istanbul in 2017, 18, 17, yeah, people telling that, Turkey is not a place where we can make investments anymore, that's not safe. So Armenia, yes, it was seen as the plan B. And that's how some of them would call it, even Armenia as plan B, after decades of a very limited level of attention or interest towards Armenia. But now it's really fresh. I would suspect that it should have had an impact on the Armenians of Turkey as well. Maybe they are, again, they're a bit more careful now, not only what concerns the security, the situation in Armenia, but also about how that approach, how that interest could be perceived in Turkey, where anti-Armenianness has been on the rise during the war also, and because of the war also, as Harut said. So we'll see.
Joanne, you also.
I was just going to echo, what you said earlier, Salin, that I know of families who sort of left right after the blast, or who were planning to go to Armenia, not just because of the explosion in Lebanon, but the currency crisis and just the general crisis in the country started to feel untenable. I know of one family who left right after, and then of course that was right before the war started. And then another who, like the example you gave, that sort of changed their minds. So there's, I think, the feeling that there is a possibility, like a way to get another passport and go to this other place, is kind of shifting now, that that other possibility feels even less stable than before, because the situation in Lebanon is so dire right now that I think for people to pause and reconsider moving on should speak to the feeling anyway, from the perspective of people not in Armenia, about what it's like, what it would be like to move there, and the possibility of it being a stable place of refuge in this moment.
Salin, I want to ask a question. I want to ask a question to Joanne, Harak, and whoever can speak about Lebanon, about the famous story of the imprisonment of Maral Najarian in Azerbaijan. I don't know if you have any insight about the effect that this action had on Lebanese Armenians and their perceptions about moving to Armenia.
Perhaps someone could very briefly explain to some of our attendees what happened.
Well, I would do that, Huri. So Maral Najarian was a Lebanese Armenian who moved to live in Armenia just before the war started, maybe just a few weeks. And she was captured by the Azerbaijani forces, and she was immediately imprisoned, and all news were cut off. And she remained in Azerbaijani captivity for almost 5-6 months, and there were accusations against her that she's a spy, etc. But eventually, she, by the mediation of the Red Cross and Lebanese officials and other Armenian groups, she was released. But her story garnered a lot of attention, being her a civilian woman who was also from diaspora, that also helped in getting in more attention. And her family and her friends and everybody advocated for the story. That's why it became a really very big story, and parliamentarians in Armenia, in Europe, in Russia, in different places also echoed that story. It became an international. It became an international story at the end. So yeah.
Harut, correct me if I'm wrong, but if I'm not mistaken, the person she was traveling with, her male friend, is still imprisoned, correct?
Yes, and he is being charged with. I mean, it's funny, being charged with mercenaries. Well, with mercenarism, just only because he holds a Lebanese passport. He's another Lebanese Armenian. Yeah, I mean, it's basically being used to counter the Armenian the Armenian actions, legal actions against Azerbaijan at the moment, or political accusations also against Azerbaijan's and Turkey's use of mercenaries, which was well documented. So they captured this one Lebanese Armenian and made his story as their counter move against the Armenians, accusing Armenians of using mercenaries. So that also helped. That also made Maral Najarian's story also.
It also taps into a discourse in Azerbaijan that Armenians are a foreign group, that they're not indigenous to the region, and that they're migrating there to take the land from Azerbaijanis. That's one of the other issues. It comes into this whole idea of Armenian diaspora.
Indeed, yeah, and that was also leveraged in this war by the Azerbaijani propaganda to portray those Armenian repatriates as foreign groups, or even label them as Asala or other armed groups, etc.
I'm sure the capturing and frankly the publicity of Maral Najarian also was, useful in that it probably deterred and scares, of course, people to move, right? But I don't know if you necessarily needed that face to create fear, given the aftermath of the war. So I'm not so sure, who. I mean, she certainly is being used in some form, but I don't know to what extent it changes the texture on the ground so much. But I don't know, maybe Joanne feels differently. But what's interesting a little bit for me, and as we wrap up this discussion, since we're already over, and I'll give everyone an opportunity to say, a couple sentences, literally final. But this wait and see, we still have to see, right? That was sort of the coming out of my last question about moving to Armenia. Meanwhile, Armenians are still moving to work in Turkey. That the existential crisis that I sort of mentioned that is in Armenia, maybe it's not in Armenia, and it's actually in the communities we're specifically been working on, which sort of makes me really feel how relevant this three-part panel actually was. And we didn't even mean for it to be like this, right? And maybe even initially, people might have thought, audience members included, like, they're talking about Armenians in the Middle East and look what just happened in Armenia and in Karabakh and in Artsakh. But I think we've come to show, this still actually matters, and ever the more so. Maybe I'll just stop here, and then I'll give everyone an opportunity to just say a couple sentences, please, too, because we really are wrapping up, but I want to give everyone the opportunity to say something, since it's actually our last coming together. Maybe I'll leave the panelists last, and then Huri as the final speaker. Maybe if it's okay, I'm just going to go with my co-panelist that day in Joanne. So go ahead, Joanne.
Well, it's been a pleasure to speak on these issues with all of you. I've learned a lot, and I think what you said, Solene, it's really right, that to understand Armenian studies today and the contemporary situation of Armenians around the world and in Hayastan too, it's important to have these conversations together and in dialogue. They're also deeply interconnected, even in ways that I wouldn't have considered. And I think everything that happened in the past year is more evidence of that. So thank you all. And I look forward to remaining in dialogue with all of you. And thank you to the audience for attending.
Harut?
Thank you, Salin. It was a really good learning experience for me too. And I truly appreciate Huri for inviting me, although I'm not an academic in the whole meaning of the word. I'm a lawyer. I practice public international law. But I think this is a good opportunity to also underline the importance of expanding Armenian studies into other areas that are very important to the Republic of Armenia and Armenians worldwide, which includes political science, security studies, and other areas that we need to pay attention more in the future in relation to Armenians.
Thank you so much, Harut and Joanne. Marisa?
Pardon? So these conversations will be missed, absolutely. And I was just thinking how quickly things can change. Just after the outcome of the Velvet Revolution, we had this emerging new wave also of investment from diasporans. And now things have dramatically changed after the outcome of the last war. And so, yeah, I hope we will continue these conversations and we will stay in touch. Thank you so much for this great event.
Thank you, Marisa. James?
Thank you to everyone for this this opportunity, and I've really benefited a lot from being involved. I guess something that has come out of these three sessions is diverse and different as the different communities across the diaspora in the Middle East are. They are united by a number of concerns, such as with the Republic of Armenia. I mean, now with the Republic of Armenia with genocide recognition, and I think that one common theme that I see a lot is the fear of loss and a fear of loss. Now you've got Azerbaijan threatening Tunik province and saying we're going to take that as well, and that's a very real possibility. And tying into this this possibility of Biden recognizing the Armenian genocide, I mean, there are these valuables that the Armenians pass down from generation to generation, which are built around the fact that things get lost. Land gets lost, home gets lost. And the reality is it's the same situation now as it has been. And I think this is one of the common themes that despite the differences between Iranian, Syrian, Lebanese Armenians, that they are constantly preoccupied with and worried about.
Thanks, James. Hirag and Chris, maybe, who would like to finish up?
Yeah, right. I'll use my 1 minute to try to quickly answer two questions in the Q&A window that are very much interrelated. There was a question about, very quick, about the Hamshen Armenians and what they do. And there was a question about any cultural activities that these Muslim Armenians engage with. And that brought to my mind the Hamshen Armenians themselves, who are a subsection or subfaction of Muslim Armenians in this case. And yes, they do engage in linguistic activities. They try to, they even publish booklets, monthly periodicals with their own Armenian dialect. That's as short as I can answer that question. And yeah, it was a pleasure to be with all of you, and I also learned a lot. And definitely there are lots of connections between these communities, both historically but also their current conditions, and our topics. And it was also a pleasure to me to learn about your work, each one of you individually. Thank you, Huri, for organizing it.
Thanks, Hirag. Christopher?
Yeah, I'll just echo all of those things. This has been an incredible opportunity to get to know all of you and your scholarship, and to get a better sense of all of these different communities and places as well. And I think I would just end by emphasizing that there are all of these connections that I think that we can see also in things like repertoires of placemaking and of of actual institutional entanglements. And I think one of the things that's been really wonderful is to be able to see, not just, okay, well, we're all different, diaspora, Armenian communities, but actually that there are these sort of tangible and quite remarkable ways that these places do have similarities, and their entanglements and their similar repertoires, and all of your work has helped me to be able to thematize those in my own work. So I deeply appreciate it, and I expect to continue these conversations with all of you. So thank you.
Thank you, Christopher. And Hudi, please, if you can wrap us up.
Sure. Thank you all very much. I'm the one who should be grateful, and I am very grateful for all of you. It actually is a lot to ask for all of you to be here 3 times, and the fact that you all made it 3 times and nobody got out of it at some point by saying, I don't think I can make it the 3rd time, I think is saying a lot. Thank you for your commitment, devotion. It means a lot, not just to me personally, which it does, but I think to Armenian studies, to diaspora studies. I think it says a lot. I think the number one most important thing I got out of this is the importance of diaspora, the importance of the Armenian diaspora, and not just out of our conversations, but what actually has transpired in the past few months. I think the war and the aftermath of the war drove home even more for me the significance of the maintenance of the Armenian diaspora, and how important it is to study that diaspora. And we have seen what has happened to the Middle East, the communities in the Middle East, the Armenian communities in the Middle East. And so I hope that we can get back one day those communities, that we can rebuild those communities. I know it's a very optimistic viewpoint, and maybe we won't be able to, but I hope that at the very least we can maintain the communities that still exist today, and that we don't lose them, but in fact we can strengthen them, and we can strengthen the studies that we do on them, historical, anthropological, sociological, political, and so forth. So that's what I'm taking away from this, and I hope maybe we can do more series of different communities across the world, and maybe we'll return to the Middle East again. So thank you again very much, and of course this will be on our YouTube channel, so tell your friends. Thanks again. Thank you again, Soli, for taking us through today, and everyone else as well.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Thanks.
Thanks, Hadak. Thanks, Chris.
Thank you all.
Minak Barov.
Thank you.
Yes, tak barov.
Best tune.